The year is 1708. In the mountain monastery of Velethar, the morning bells ring through a valley already conquered by silence. The women inside rise before dawn, as they have for generations, voices lifting in the ancient rhythm of the Greek liturgy, syllables shaped by centuries, echoing against the frost-dark stone, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. But this morning the prayer carries a different weight. It trembles, thin and uncertain, as though even God hesitates to listen. Beyond the walls, the snow crunches beneath foreign boots. The Ottoman patrol approaches with torches that hiss in the wind. The scent of oil and iron seeps through the cracks of the wooden door. Abbess Helena Calderis feels it before she hears it, the quiet rupture of an era ending. She has known this sound before, the rhythm of empire devouring everything it touches. She motions for silence. The sisters obey. For a moment all is still, except the slow drip of wax and the pulse of breath in the dark. Then the knock comes, measured and final. History rarely announces itself so politely. When the door opens, the first light of fire spills into the chapel. A voice speaks in Turkish, translated by a trembling Greek tongue. From this day forward, it says, all prayers will be offered in the language of the Sultan. The abbess closes her eyes. Around her, the others bow their heads. The bell rings one last time before it is silenced forever, and somewhere between that sound and the stillness that follows, a language begins to die. The soldiers entered not as raiders but as record keepers. Their boots were clean, their eyes detached, their movements rehearsed. They came carrying scrolls, ledgers, and sealed jars of ink darker than night itself. They did not look at the women. They looked at the words. One officer, tall, expressionless, gestured toward the altar. He spoke Turkish with the rhythm of a legal decree, and the translator, a local convert whose voice trembled like a man translating his own death sentence, rendered it in Greek. By order of His Excellency the Governor of Ioannina, all sacred texts shall be translated into the tongue of the empire. The language of rebellion is hereby abolished. No sword was drawn, no blood was spilled. Only parchment and ink, authority written instead of spoken. Abbess Helena stepped forward, her hands folded around an old codex bound in leather, its pages soft from centuries of turning. It contained the Psalms, the Gospels, the prayers of their mothers and grandmothers, all in the language of the apostles. The officer nodded, and a clerk approached with the jar of Ottoman ink. Without a word, they lifted the book and submerged it. The ink swallowed it whole, page by page, dissolving scripture into a darkness so complete it seemed to drink the candlelight. The translator's voice cracked as he whispered, "It is done." But Helena spoke, her Greek steady and cold. "You have baptized our faith in your darkness. You think the ink will change its tongue, but faith cannot drown." The clerk hesitated. The officer turned away. Outside, snow began to fall, ash-white against the black stains spreading across the altar. Sister Nicoletta, the youngest, stared at the dripping pages. "The letters are gone," she murmured. "No," Helena replied. "They've only gone deeper." In that moment the act of erasure became the first act of preservation, because what the empire thought it destroyed was already memorized in hearts, etched into breath, and carved into the muscle of prayer. When they left, they carried the codex away to be archived in the provincial chancery, another relic silenced by bureaucracy. But the sisters knew what the soldiers did not, that every act of translation is a confession of fear. The ink still glistened on the stone, black and wet, like the mouth of a wound. As the door closed, Helena looked at the stains on her fingers and whispered, "If they would erase us, we shall become the script they cannot read." That night, the monastery's fire was dimmed. The air reeked of ink. The wind moved through the cracks in the chapel, whispering a single question that no empire ever wants to hear. What happens when the word refuses to die? By 1708, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents. Its reach was not measured in distance, but in silence. Cities that once sang in Greek, Armenian, or Latin now echoed with the same call to prayer, the same syllables of power. It was not enough to rule the body. The empire sought dominion over the tongue. In Istanbul, decrees were written in elegant Arabic script, commanding that all worship, from the Bosphorus to the Ionian coast, be conducted solely in the Sultan's language. To pray in any other was to defy God's appointed order. The policy was called alignment, a word that sounded benign, administrative, efficient. But to those who lived beneath it, alignment meant erasure. Churches were not burned, they were translated. Scriptures were not confiscated, they were revised. 1,000 years of faith was rewritten in the ink of empire. Each new translation came with a promise: obedience would bring peace. The ones who resisted did not die by the sword. They died in the archives, reduced to marginal notes and footnotes in languages no one read. Velethar, a small convent hidden in the Epirus Mountains, had been spared for decades because it was forgotten. The road that led to it wound through valleys no mapmaker cared to draw. Its bells rang for a people who no longer existed, its prayers for a world already buried. The sisters believed isolation was protection, but empire has a way of finding what resists it. The same year the decree reached Thessaloniki, a sub-governor in Ioannina sent inspectors westward, carrying orders sealed in wax. The edict was simple: every house of worship shall speak the Sultan's tongue, lest their silence breed rebellion. What began as a matter of administration became theology. Language became sin. And in that sin, punishment found purpose. For an empire built on conquest, faith was no longer a matter of salvation. It was a matter of control. To change a people's God, one must first change his name. To change his name, one must teach them to forget the sound of their own prayers. Abbess Helena Calderis had led Velethar for 23 years. Before the decree, before the soldiers, before the ink, she had been known for her silence. A woman of few words, she believed faith did not live in speech, but in endurance. Her hair, once black, had silvered early. Her eyes carried the calm of one who had already buried everything she loved. She was not born for rebellion, but history rarely asks permission. Beneath her gentleness lay a mind trained to see the invisible threads that bind language to memory. She had copied psalms since childhood, learning how each letter could hold a soul. "If they take our words," she once told a novice, "they take our dead." She understood that erasing Greek was not just the loss of a tongue, but the burial of every ancestor who had prayed in it. Sister Nicoletta was her opposite in age, but her mirror in spirit, only 22, with ink-stained fingers and a hunger to preserve what she could not protect. She was the convent scribe, the one who spent nights bent over parchment, copying verses even after candles died. When the decree came, she hid a handful of psalm fragments beneath the altar, written so small they could fit within her palm. Her faith was not quiet, it was desperate, young, and burning. To her, every word was a rebellion, every Greek syllable a weapon sharper than steel. And then there was Sister Sophia, the deaf one. She had never heard a hymn in her life, yet she knew its rhythm better than any of them. She felt sound as vibration, language as movement through air and skin. When the others prayed, she closed her eyes and sensed the pattern of their breath against the walls. "I cannot hear God," she once signed to Helena, "but I can feel when he listens." In Sophia's world, silence was not absence, it was the only language that could not be rewritten. She became the convent's living paradox, the one who could not hear, yet preserved the purest echo of their prayer. Between the three of them, the story of Velethar found its balance. Helena's wisdom, Nicoletta's flame, Sophia's silence. Three faces of the same resistance: memory, defiance, and perception. The empire would soon call them heretics. History would call them forgotten. But what they carved into the walls would one day prove that remembrance has many tongues, and silence is one of them. The decree arrived 3 weeks after the ink ritual. It came sealed with the insignia of the Sublime Porte. written in Arabic script and translated into Greek by trembling local scribes. The parchment declared that all monasteries under Ottoman rule must henceforth conduct prayer and teaching exclusively in the Sultan's tongue. The order spoke of unity, of divine clarity, of the necessity for all subjects of God's empire to worship in one language. It did not speak of fear, but fear was its grammar. The empire understood what many conquerors never learned, that killing a people's body is a brief victory. Killing their words is eternal. To erase a language is to silence every prayer ever uttered in it. And so the strategy was elegant, bloodless, bureaucratic. Priests were instructed to destroy unauthorized texts. Translators were appointed to provide official versions of Scripture. Those who complied were rewarded with food and protection. Those who hesitated were marked as dissenters. The empire did not call it punishment, it called it purification. When the imperial messenger read the decree aloud in the courtyard of Velethar, his voice echoed off the stone like a sermon from another god. The sisters stood in line, their heads bowed. Abbess Helena held her crucifix beneath her robes, the metal cold against her chest. The messenger demanded their Greek manuscripts. She handed him a single volume, the one already drowned in Ottoman ink. He accepted it without inspection, unaware that every psalm, every gospel, every prayer he thought he confiscated still lived in the minds of those before him. "Your compliance honors the Sultan," he said. Helena bowed slightly. Her silence was perfect. That evening, she gathered the sisters in the chapel. "They have translated God," she told them, her voice steady but hollow. "They believe that by changing his words, they change his nature, but we will not speak the emperor's tongue in his house." Nicoletta's hands shook. "What if they listen? Then we whisper," Helena said. "And if they forbid whispers, we breathe hymn instead." Sophia smiled faintly, tracing a candle's heat with her fingertips. "Then even air will become prayer." That night the convent recited the Ottoman version of the creed for the first time out loud, obedient, flawless. But within each Turkish syllable, their hearts pulsed with Greek. It was a layered prayer, two languages coexisting like light and shadow, to the empire's ears, submission, to God's defiance. Reports sent from Ioannina later described Velethar as fully aligned. In truth, it had become the empire's first illusion. The nuns learned to mouth words they did not mean, to sing songs whose meanings they inverted. They turned obedience into camouflage. What the Ottomans called translation was, in Velethar, transformation, the rebirth of faith inside its own disguise. And in the art of hiding, they found survival. At dawn, the call to prayer rose from the valley like smoke. Its echo climbed the mountains and slipped through the broken shutters of Velethar. The sisters gathered in the chapel as commanded, their breath fogging in the cold air, their voices preparing to betray their own hearts. On the altar lay the imperial translation of the creed, freshly copied in Ottoman Turkish, bound in calfskin, smelling of ink and power. Abbess Helena stood before it, her face unreadable. "They will listen for our tongues," she said quietly. "So we must teach them to hear nothing." The bell was gone, melted down by soldiers who saw music as rebellion. In its absence, silence became the new rhythm of worship. The first verse began in Turkish. The words moved awkwardly, heavy, foreign, like stones pushed uphill. The soldiers stationed at the gate heard nothing suspicious. It was the sound of obedience. But to those within the chapel, it was something else entirely. Beneath each Ottoman syllable, another word pulsed, a word remembered, older, whispered not by lips, but by breath. Helena began the second verse, her tone steady, the Turkish consonants crisp. Yet each pause fell precisely where the Greek cadence would have been. Between the phrases, the unspoken liturgy lived. The empire had taught them new words, but could not teach them new meanings. Nicoletta's lips trembled as she mouthed the Turkish line for Lord of Mercy. In her mind, she said, "Kyrie eleison." 2 languages occupied one mouth. 2 empires shared one body. The guards who listened from outside thought the women docile. They wrote in their reports, prayers conducted in full compliance, spirits subdued. But if they had stepped inside, they would have felt it, the vibration in the walls, the low hum of memory passing through stone. Sophia stood near the back, her eyes closed, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. She could not hear the words, but she felt them. Each syllable, each breath, struck her like waves against her palms. To her, the 2 languages became one, merging in the same rhythm as heartbeat and silence. "They think we obey," Nicoletta whispered afterward, when the soldiers had gone. "We are teaching God to speak through lies," Helena answered. "Even truth must disguise itself to survive." That night, when they prayed alone, they no longer spoke aloud. They mouthed the Greek prayers in darkness, each exhale a secret. The empire recorded perfect compliance for the next 3 months. Not a single report of defiance, not a single outburst. But what those reports could not measure was the quiet contagion of faith that had learned to hide inside its enemy's grammar. They prayed in Turkish for the empire. They prayed in Greek for eternity. The order to seal Velethar came without ceremony. One afternoon, soldiers descended from the mountain pass, nailed the iron gates shut, and left without a word. The sound of hammer against metal rang through the valley like a verdict. From that moment, the monastery ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. No food entered, no message left. For 5 days, silence became their captor. On the first day, the sisters prayed as usual, their bodies still strong, their minds clinging to rhythm. On the second, hunger arrived like a polite guest, noticed but not feared. By the third, it had grown teeth. The women no longer spoke, for every word cost too much breath. Candles burned low, dripping wax into bowls to measure time. Helena sat before the altar, her lips unmoving, her thoughts turning toward the ancient saints who had fasted in deserts and caves. "They believe deprivation will teach us obedience," she thought. "They have forgotten that suffering is our language." On the 4th day, snow began to fall, piling against the barred windows, sealing them further in. The air turned cold and thin. Sister Nicoletta's hands shook as she tried to copy a verse from memory, the letters uneven. "What if they mean to starve us?" she asked. "Then our hunger becomes a prayer," Helena whispered. The sound of footsteps outside made them all freeze. Through a crack in the wall, Sophia watched soldiers laughing by their fire, roasting bread, their faces glowing orange in the night. The smell of it reached the chapel, sweet, unbearable. Sophia closed her eyes, pressed her palms to the wall, and began to move them in circles, small, steady, silent. The rhythm matched the lost chants of the liturgy. "She is praying," Nicoletta breathed. "No," Helena said softly. "She is listening for God in stone." On the 5th day, the air grew heavy, with smoke from dying candles. The nuns' bodies trembled in fevered unity, mouths moving without sound. The Empire's report would later describe this period as corrective isolation. The term sounded administrative, harmless, but those who lived it called it the dark fast. In those days, faith separated from flesh. Words faded first, replaced by breathing. Then breath itself became the only prayer left. Hunger taught them what empire never understood, that language carved into the soul cannot be starved. When the guards opened the gates at last, they found the sisters kneeling, faces gaunt, eyes shining with something that looked too much like victory. The soldiers called it madness. History would call it devotion. On the 6th night, when hunger had turned their voices into whispers of breath, Abbess Helena gathered the sisters before the chapel wall. The plaster was rough and cold beneath their fingers, marked only by age and soot. "They have taken our ink," she said softly. "Then we must write with light." She broke a candle in half, pressed its burning tip against the wall. The flame hissed, leaving a faint trail of smoke that curled and faded. Nothing remained until she noticed the heat had blackened the surface, a fragile scar shaped like a letter. It answers us, she murmured. Stone remembers fire. Nicoletta understood first. She took another candle, steadier, sharper, and began to carve with the softened tip, the wax leaving residue as it burned. The letter emerged, Alpha, then another Omega. Soon the sisters joined her, each taking one candle, each marking one prayer. Sophia, who could not hear, traced her symbols by touch, her fingers following the warmth left behind by others. The walls began to fill with trembling light. Every candle became a psalm, every flicker a heartbeat of faith. From a distance, it must have looked like madness. Women burning their walls, whispering to flames. But within that silence was perfect order. Helena moved among them, guiding the lines, ensuring each symbol aligned with the next. They worked in rhythm, carving prayers into stone through fire, the wax pooling at their feet like spilled time. As dawn approached, the air thickened with smoke and reverence. The final candle was lit by Nicoletta, her hands shaking but her eyes steady. This light belongs to him, she said, and pressed it deep into the wall. The flame sputtered, gasped, then died, leaving behind the faint outline of a Greek phrase. Phi nu sigma kappa oto epsilon iota, light in the darkness. The wax hardened over it, sealing the word inside the wall like a secret heart. When the soldiers returned that morning, they smelled the smoke but saw nothing. The inscriptions were invisible under soot. They've stopped praying, one said. At last, another answered. But beneath the surface, beneath the centuries, the walls of Velethar were now alive with words that no empire could read. The candles melted to stubs, their wicks still glowing faintly in the ashes. In those ashes lived the first scripture of resistance letters carved not for the living, but for memory itself. By the seventh night, the air inside Velethar had grown thick with smoke. The walls now bore 1,000 half-formed letters, each burned by candlelight, each whispering its own fragment of prayer. The sisters had stopped eating, stopped speaking. The only movement was the flicker of fire on skin and stone. In the lower crypt, where the air was colder and heavier, Sister Nicoletta continued alone. The others had begged her to rest, but she refused. Each night they erase one more of our words, she said. If I stop, there will be nothing left to remember us by. She carried a small candle and a fragment of iron she had sharpened against the altar, using it to carve deeper into the damp limestone. The words she wrote were no longer psalms, but fragments of memory, names, places, syllables she feared would vanish. Helena found her there near midnight, her lips blackened with soot, her eyes bright with fever. You must breathe, Helena whispered. I am breathing, Nicoletta replied. I am breathing our words into stone. Smoke rose around them like incense from a dying world. Each exhale carried less air, more ash. Sophia waited by the stairs, watching the shadows dance across the walls. To her, the sound of their coughing was like thunder far away. When Helena returned to the chapel, she realized Nicoletta had not followed. She descended again, calling softly. The crypt was silent, except for the hiss of a dying flame. The candle had fallen onto the floor, its wax spreading like spilled blood. Nicoletta was kneeling before the wall, her head bowed, her hand still pressed to the stone. The letters she had carved formed the phrase she had never spoken aloud. Phio meganuv, mu-ho nu the upsilon, mu-ho tau alpha, iota, our voice remembers. The smoke had taken her long before the prayer was complete. Helena knelt beside her, touched her cheek, and whispered the rest of the line, and memory does not die. She closed the girl's eyes, then blew out the candle. For a moment, the darkness was absolute. The next morning, when the soldiers came for inspection, they found the sisters gathered in the chapel as before, faces calm, eyes hollow. No one mentioned the smell of smoke from below. In the Empire's report, Velethar remained compliant. Subjects observed in silence, the entry read. No incident recorded. History has always preferred silence. It is easier to archive. When the soldiers discovered that one of the sisters had died, they did not punish the convent immediately. They waited. Empires always wait. A week later, an officer arrived from Ioannina, a tall man in a fur-lined coat, eyes the colour of burnt glass. His name was Hassan Pasha, known for turning resistance into obedience without shedding blood. He entered the chapel alone, his boots echoing against the marble. The nuns stood motionless as statues. "Which of you is the abbess?" he asked through his translator. Helena stepped forward. "You will accompany me," he said. They led her to the courtyard, where snow had melted into black mud. 2 soldiers brought a wooden chair, and she was made to sit beneath the shadow of the broken bell tower. Before her stood a lectern holding the Ottoman translation of the Gospels. "You are to teach your sisters the new language of faith," Hassan declared. "You will read from this book and instruct them to repeat after you. This is the will of the Sultan and, therefore, of God." The words were spoken with the certainty of law. Helena stared at the book without touching it. The parchment gleamed under the pale sun, its letters neat, official, lifeless. "If this is the word of God," she said quietly, "then why does it need your permission to be spoken?" Hassan smiled, not out of amusement, but pity. "You mistake pride for piety," he said. "Faith must be uniform, or it fractures. Translation is mercy." Helena's eyes hardened. "Faith has no translator," she said. The translator hesitated, unsure if he should repeat it. When he did, the phrase hung in the cold air like a bell that refused to die. Hassan stepped closer. "Then your faith will die in your tongue," he said, "and your tongue will die with you." "So be it," Helena replied. "But even when you teach your sons to pray in Turkish, they will still dream in Greek." For a moment, silence passed between them, heavy and dangerous. Hassan ordered her to begin the lesson. She did. But as she read the Ottoman text aloud, her voice changed. The rhythm was wrong, the meaning twisted. The soldiers listening outside could not understand the tension beneath her words. But Sophia, standing near the doorway, could feel it, the air itself vibrating differently. Helena's recitation had become a translation in reverse. Every Turkish verse she spoke carried a hidden Greek one beneath it. Each word of submission carried its opposite meaning in spirit. She was dismantling the empire's language from within, turning obedience into resistance, syllable by syllable. When she finished, Hassan nodded approvingly. "You see," he said, "it is not so hard to change the tongue of faith." Helena met his gaze. "I changed nothing," she said. "You only heard what you wished to hear." The next day, she was placed under guard. The soldiers believed they had broken her. Reports sent to Ioannina described her as docile, reformed, linguistically compliant. But in truth, she had planted a weapon sharper than steel, a phrase that would outlive both of them. Faith has no translator. The words would one day be found scratched faintly into the plaster near the chapel door, written in Greek letters so small they were invisible unless caught by candlelight. Winter surrendered slowly that year. The snow melted from the roofs first, then from the courtyards, leaving behind mud and the scent of decay. Velethar no longer echoed with prayer. The last sound of Greek had faded weeks earlier, not from surrender but from silence. When the provincial inspector arrived in early spring, he found only the dead and the obedient. Hassan Pasha had already left, his work considered complete. The convent's gates, once symbols of devotion, were now painted with the mark of the Janissary garrison. The empire had transformed faith into function. Within a month, the Monastery of Velethar was renamed Fort Caledon, a small administrative outpost for mountain patrols. The chapel was cleared of icons, the altar dismantled. Soldiers slept where the sisters had prayed. Their voices filled the space with laughter, dice, and orders shouted across stone. The walls that had glowed once with candlelight now bore maps and ledgers to the empire. This was victory efficient, bloodless, complete. No martyrs, no funerals, no witnesses. When the villagers below asked what had become of the nuns, they were told the women had been transferred to a safer convent closer to the sea. It was a lie repeated so often it became truth in memory. Helena was last seen being led into the forest with 2 guards. Some said she was taken to Ioannina. Others whispered she was buried beneath the chapel floor. None of it reached the records. The official documents list 21 transfers, 21 signatures, 21 names that never appeared again. In bureaucratic language, they ceased to exist. The empire excelled at such disappearances. Paper made them easy. By midsummer, the new garrison commander reported to Constantinople that the former convent has been repurposed for the stability of imperial oversight. The phrase former convent appeared 3 times in the report, as if repetition could make it true. The bell tower was torn down, its bronze melted into musket parts. The courtyard where herbs once grew was paved in gravel. The well was filled with stones. Nothing sacred remained except the walls, and even those were painted over. But walls are patient. Beneath the layers of lime and soot, the wax from the sisters' candles hardened, sealing the Greek letters within like fossils of prayer. To anyone who entered, Velethar was a garrison, nothing more. Yet on certain nights, when the wind moved through the cracks just right, the soldiers claimed they heard whispers rising from the floor. Some said it was the sound of the mountain itself. Others said it was language refusing to die. No report ever mentioned it, of course. Empires do not record ghosts. But Velethar had become one, a ghost made of stone and silence. The year was 2013 when Velethar returned to history. A team of restoration archaeologists from the University of Athens had been commissioned to survey Ottoman-era fortifications in the Epirus Mountains. What they expected to find were remnants of military architecture, barracks, stables, perhaps the foundations of an old garrison. What they found instead rewrote silence. The building had been marked on regional maps as Fort Caledon, 18th century outpost. Its walls were thick with soot, its roof half collapsed, the air damp with the scent of rot and time. The team entered through a rusted iron door that groaned as if exhaling the past. Inside, the light from their torches caught shapes on the stone indentations, faint lines, strange shadows that refused to be random. At first they thought it was erosion. Then one of the interns, a linguistics student named Eleni Daskalou, brushed her gloved hand against the surface and froze. "These are letters," she whispered. The marks were shallow but deliberate, hundreds of them, carved into the walls in looping patterns. They were Greek, but reversed as though written for someone reading from inside the stone. The team worked for hours, photographing every inch, documenting each curve, each stroke. Under ultraviolet light, the carvings glowed faintly. In several places, melted wax residue clung to the grooves, mixed with traces of soot. A pattern emerged, circles of text surrounding a central point, like constellations of prayer. The deeper they went, the more the marks multiplied. Some letters were perfect, others broke midway, abandoned by trembling hands. In the farthest corner, near what had once been the chapel, they found the largest inscription, an entire wall covered in writing. The archaeologists fell silent. It was as if the mountain itself had begun to speak. The letters, though mirrored, were unmistakable. Translated, the phrase read, Iphi omega nui mu alphas, theta upsilon mu atau alpha iota, our voice remembers. Beneath it, smaller fragments appeared psalms, invocations, and a single line that defied translation, written in both Greek and Ottoman script, fused together like 2 tongues forced into one. The discovery shocked the academic community. For decades, historians had debated whether linguistic suppression during the late Ottoman period in Epirus extended to monastic communities. Here was proof carved in stone in the handwriting of the erased. Radiocarbon tests dated the wax to the early 18th century. The soot contained traces of herbs used in candle making by nuns. The conclusion was inescapable. This fort had once been a convent, its walls a scripture of resistance. When the team published their findings, a local newspaper ran the headline, "The Monastery that Spoke from Stone." The story made brief headlines, then faded from public interest history. After all, is selective in what it chooses to remember. But among scholars and those who listened closely, the name Velethar began to circulate again, like a whispered prayer returning after centuries of sleep. When the photographs were developed, the truth became undeniable. The central inscription, more distinct than the others, dominated the chapel wall. Each letter had been carved with deliberate force, as if the hand that made it knew time itself would try to erase it. Iphio meganui mu, alphas theta upsilon mu, atau alpha iota, our voice remembers. The words were perfectly mirrored, meaning they had been written from the inside out. The discovery puzzled the researchers at first. Why carve backwards, unless the writer believed they were speaking to another world? Dr. Petros Anagnostou, the lead archaeologist, noted in his report, "The inversion suggests intention. The script was meant to be read by the dead, or by God himself, beyond the material veil. The letters varied in depth, some shallow, others gouged into the stone with desperate strength. Beneath the Greek, the team found faint scratches in Ottoman script, almost invisible, forming the same phrase phonetically. Two languages intertwined like prayer and punishment. Forensic analysis showed traces of blood in the grooves, suggesting the final words were written not with tools, but with broken fingernails. This was not decoration, it was testament. The archivists tried to decipher whether the inscription was the work of one hand or many. Some believed it was Sister Nicoletta's final prayer, completed by others after her death. Others argued it was a collective act, a chorus of resistance engraved through agony. What united them was the understanding that these were not mere letters. They were voices, frozen, reversed, preserved. When the inscription was cleaned under controlled light, the surrounding soot formed halos around each letter, glowing faintly like an echo of candlelight long extinguished. It was as if the wall itself had memorized the prayers that once burned there. The researchers stood in silence. Even the hum of their instruments seemed intrusive. Our voice remembers. The phrase haunted everyone who entered that room. It transcended language, belonging to no empire, no religion. It spoke to something older, the human refusal to vanish. In their official report, the team avoided poetic interpretation. They described it clinically: primary inscription, Hellenic script, mirrored orientation, approx 18th century, possible record of linguistic suppression. But in interviews, several admitted that the experience unsettled them. One technician, when asked what it felt like to stand before the wall, said only, "It was like the stones were listening to us." The museum in Athens later displayed a digital replica of the wall. Visitors passed by it quickly, barely reading the translation. Yet for those who lingered, the phrase lingered back. Our voice remembers, not my or their, but our, a collective defiance that reached beyond the grave. No empire can own that pronoun. It belongs to memory alone. Weeks after the initial translation, the research team continued to examine the chapel's surfaces with high-resolution spectral imaging. It was then that a new pattern emerged, one not of letters, but of residue. Along the lower portions of the walls, where the carved Greek phrases were most concentrated, tiny deposits of hardened material shimmered under ultraviolet light. At first, the archaeologists assumed it was mineral buildup, or perhaps bat guano from centuries of neglect. But chemical testing told another story. The residue contained traces of beeswax, mixed with the faint presence of herbs, thyme, laurel, myrrh, the same ingredients used in handmade convent candles of the 17th century. More astonishingly, microscopic analysis revealed imprints of wicks. The wax had not dripped from torches or lamps. It had been pressed deliberately into the stone. Each mark was a fingerprint of flame. Dr. Anagnostou wrote in his journal, "The wax aligns precisely with the carvings, as though each word had been sealed by light." He believed the nuns had used melted candles not merely to illuminate their prayers, but to consecrate them, each stroke of wax an offering, a sacrament. To the empire, candles were tools of ritual. To these women, they were language itself. When the archaeologists gently heated a small flake of residue for analysis, the air filled with a faint sweetness, the ghost of honey and smoke, trapped for 300 years. One of the younger researchers wept. "It smells like a church," she whispered. In that moment, science met sanctity. The wax was not decoration, it was evidence of continuity. Fire had carried their faith when words could not. The team mapped over 200 such wax traces, noting their precise positions relative to the inscriptions. Most followed the same pattern, a circle of small burns surrounding each carved phrase, like halos of light around invisible saints. Some were layered, suggesting the same prayers had been sealed night after night, year after year. Each flicker of flame had left its fingerprint on history, invisible until now. When the data was published, historians debated the interpretation. Some called it superstition, others called it survival, but all agreed on one point. The wax was old, impossibly so, and it had no reason to be there except love. In their final report, the scientists included a photograph, one wall section, where wax, soot, and carving converged in a shape resembling wings. Beneath it, faint but legible, a single Greek word glowed under ultraviolet light: Zeta Omegae, life. It was as if the candles themselves had written their own resurrection. When the mirrored script of Velethar was first deciphered, scholars argued over its meaning. Some dismissed it as primitive error, the byproduct of untrained hands carving blindly in smoke. But those who had seen the wall themselves knew better. The precision was too consistent, the reversal too deliberate. Every letter faced inward, as though the writers intended their prayers for an audience beyond the human eye. They were not writing for us, Dr. Anagnosto told the Hellenic Review in 2014. They were writing from the inside of death, toward eternity. His words captured what language alone could not: the sense that the Nuns of Velethar had redefined communication itself. To write backwards was to renounce the empire's linear order, to reject the syntax of control. Inverting the script was not mistake, but defiance, an act of metaphysical rebellion. For centuries, Greek monks had written psalms facing east, toward the rising light. The Sisters of Velethar turned inward into darkness, believing that the truest conversation with God was one he alone could read. Their writing became both confession and covenant, a way of speaking to a world that had already ended. The mirrored letters also carried another symbolism: protection. In Byzantine mysticism, reversed writing was used to bind evil spirits, to confuse the forces that sought to destroy. By writing backward, the nuns were protecting the words from their oppressors, hiding them behind the veil of reflection. What the empire could not read, it could not erase. The archaeologists later noted that many inscriptions began from corners or cracks in the wall, moving inward like spirals text unfolding toward the heart of stone. It was as though each woman believed she was carving her way through the material world into the next. The wall was no longer boundary, it was passage. This theory found unexpected confirmation in the physical evidence. The direction of the strokes, the angle of pressure, the layering of wax all indicated that the carvers stood facing inward, bodies pressed close to the wall as if embracing it. Some lines were too low to be seen without kneeling. Others reached above human height, suggesting letters carved blindly by touch alone. The effect was almost ritualistic, as though each woman offered herself to the wall, inscribing her faith directly into its body. In doing so, they transformed death into language. To pray forward was to hope for salvation. To pray backward was to accept extinction and turn it holy. That was the theology of Velethar, the belief that God did not dwell in the living tongue but in the echo it left behind. The empire had tried to translate divinity into its own speech. The nuns responded by turning language inside out, making it unreadable to men, but luminous to eternity. It was not despair, it was strategy. Because when a people know they will be erased, they stop writing for history and start writing for resurrection. They tried to translate God, but God doesn't speak conquest. The phrase was written at the end of the Velethar report, not by a historian, but by a translator, one of the Ottoman archivists assigned to copy the field notes into Turkish. His marginalia survived purely by accident, a faint line of pencil scrawled beneath the summary of the convent's dissolution. Scholars debate whether it was irony or confession. Yet those 7 words encapsulate the entire tragedy of empire. Every conquest begins with language. The sword may win the land, but the tongue wins the soul. To translate God is to seize the right to define meaning itself, to rename, to restructure, to remake creation in the image of the victor. The Ottomans understood that power perfectly. But what they failed to grasp was that divinity cannot be edited. When Helena whispered, "Faith has no translator," she was not rejecting communication. She was rejecting ownership. Translation without consent is conquest, disguised as mercy. Empires promise unity, but unity bought with silence is only annihilation. God, if he speaks at all, speaks in multiplicity in the untranslatable murmurs of every mother tongue. That is what the sisters of Velethar knew. They refused to let their God be recited in a language of command. Their resistance was not political, it was ontological. They were defending the idea that holiness cannot be standardized. The empire's decree sought to replace variety with obedience, faith with regulation, voice with vocabulary. But language is not merely words. It is breath, memory, inheritance, the residue of being human. When they forced Greek into Turkish, they thought they were unifying belief. In truth, they were crucifying it. Every translation imposed from above becomes a small death, a wound that bleeds meaning. The nuns of Velethar turned that wound into their altar. They inverted language, they burned wax, they wrote backward into eternity, proving that even silence can rebel. They tried to translate God is more than accusation, it is prophecy. Because every empire eventually learns that words cannot be colonized. The moment you attempt to cage divinity in grammar, it escapes through the cracks. It finds refuge in song, in whisper, in stone. When the archaeologists uncovered the mirrored prayers, they were not just reading history, they were hearing the echo of that rebellion. The empire that sought to erase Greek vanished centuries ago, but the walls still speak. Not fluently, not loudly, but persistently. The phrase, "our voice remembers," is their answer to conquest. It means that faith, once uttered, never truly dies. It waits in matter, in sound, in the memory of those who will one day uncover it. God does not speak conquest because conquest ends. But language, the real, sacred kind that lives between people and their breath, outlasts it. In the ruins of every empire, you can still hear it if you listen carefully, a whisper not of submission but of return. The museum in Athens closes at dusk. The last visitors drift past the exhibit without realizing what they are seeing. To them, it is a wallstone, cracked, unremarkable. But when the lights dim for the night program, the projectors ignite, casting ultraviolet radiance across its surface. The carvings awaken. Letters bloom from shadow, glowing like embers in reverse. For a moment, the room fills with the ghost of Velethar's chapel, the texture of candle smoke, the faint shimmer of wax hardened by centuries. The projection technician adjusts the angle, and suddenly the mirrored words reflect against the glass barrier. They appear the right way around. The phrase that once could only be read from within now faces outward. I phi omega nui, mu alphas theta upsilon, mu atau alpha iota. Our voice remembers. The visitors fall silent. A child reaches toward the glass, her fingertips meeting the reflection of an alpha. The symbol ripples faintly, like water disturbed by touch. The curator explains softly that the letters are carved backward, written for the dead, she says. But the line between death and memory is thinner than glass. The camera, if this were film, would move slowly along the wall, following the arc of the phrase, each letter catching light and letting it go, the motion resembling waves against a dark shore. The sound design would be minimal. A heartbeat, the hum of distant wind, the echo of breath where voices once were. No music, no narration, only the communion of light and stone. Then the focus would tighten, closing in on the final word, theta upsilon mu atau alpha iota, remembers its edges worn smooth by time. Within the groove, a fragment of wax still clings, stubborn, golden, under the artificial light. In that single detail lives the entirety of faith, something fragile, refusing to disappear. The camera would linger there, and in the reflection of the polished glass, one might see not tourists, but the faint suggestion of veiled figures, 21 women, their heads bowed, their candles flickering. The illusion lasts only an instant, but the feeling remains. It is not fear or sorrow, but recognition, the moment you understand that memory is not the opposite of forgetting, it is the resistance to it. Outside, Athens glows with modern light, the noise of the city indifferent to the past beneath its feet. Yet in that quiet room, an empire that once erased a language is undone by the endurance of its own silence. The letters no longer belong to any faith or nation. They belong to everyone who has ever been told to stop speaking. As the projector fades, the wall returns to stone, dull, grey, ordinary. But if you listen closely, the silence hums. It carries the echo of the bell that once rang in Velethar, of Helena's whisper, of Nicoletta's breath, of Sophia's fingertips tracing flame. It carries the sound of an empire trying to translate God and failing. Because language, true language, is not born of conquest but of communion, and communion never dies. Lux in tenebris lucet, the light shines in the darkness remembers the light. And somewhere, beneath centuries of ash and empire, the walls of Velethar are still breathing.